You're listening to Releasing Trauma, a survivor's podcast. And now here's your host, Tracy Osborne. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today, we are talking about America's silent epidemic, and that is sibling sexual abuse. It happens. It happens a lot more frequently than you think it does, but it's not something that's talked about. I think sibling sexual abuse is probably more hush-hush and swept under the carpet than many other types of sexual abuse. With me today is Brad Watts. He's a licensed professional counselor and author of the best-selling book, Sibling Sexual Abuse, A Guide to Confronting America's Silent Epidemic. So, Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Like I said, this is something that's just not talked about, but I think is more prevalent in society than we realize.
Right.
And, so I guess let's start with, why do you think this is more hush-hush than, say, Uncle Joe molesting somebody, right? Or,
Yeah, there's different reasons for that. One is, we know that Uncle Joe molesting Johnny is clearly sibling sexual or sexual abuse, because it's obvious. We know kind of how to feel about that. One of the real problems is we struggle, even clinicians, in my field, struggle to identify sibling sexual abuse. I had one clinician tell me one time, is sibling sexual abuse even sexual abuse? I'm like, well, yes, of course it is. And so even within the field, we have that kind of problem. So that filters down to parents that what's the difference between sexual curiosity and when does it become abuse? And then it also complicates it for parents, because you know how to feel when somebody outside your immediate family sexually abuses your child. You can focus all your energy, to caring for your child, and all your anger and all those feelings, are directed outward. But think about it. I mean, you have one child. I have two children, so I know how I feel about both of them, and it just pulls you in all kinds of directions. And, but really in the literature and the research, we don't have a uniform definition for sibling sexual abuse everybody agrees on. So even within the field, we're struggling with that, much less, when that happens within somebody's home.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have 4 kids, and I couldn't imagine, something happening where I had to choose between one or the other.
Right.
In order to keep them safe. I just, I can't wrap my head around that and be like, okay, well, which one do I pick?
Yeah.
I guess it would be whichever one didn't piss me off that day. But, but no, I mean, seriously, that as a parent, I just could not even, number one, having your child sexually assaulted to begin with is a parent's worst nightmare. But coming to find out that it's from one of your other kids, I can't even fathom what that would do to a parent. I really can't. So, what do we do in those situations? So let me give you this scenario. So child A started their life in a abusive home, was abused, was forced to watch mom have sex with other guys, things like that.
Right.
And then child B came along. And so then child A and B were abused together. They were, locked in closets for hours on end, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so child A began abusing child B.
Mm-hmm.
And so, now there's this whole big scenario of, child A is in foster care, child B is in intensive therapy, and all of that. So, what do we do as parents to, be able to keep them together, or do we have to separate them?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great and unfortunately a common scenario. I won't say a great scenario, but it's a common scenario.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's horrific. When we talk about the effects of that. So in those kinds of situations, it goes case by case. And so that's why, team responses are important in this kind of situation. Reporting it, getting help instead of just trying to, this wasn't the case in that example, but we have so many cases where families try and sweep it under the rug, or we're going to keep it all in the family. So having it known. And so, yeah, kids may need to be separated for a time or longer, depending on the situation. But it's important that everybody gets into therapy. What we do know from the research, particularly with adolescents, is if we get kids into therapy, the success rate is insanely high. We're talking about 95 to 98% of kids that are treated, that have acted out, committed sexual harm, they receive treatment, that they're never going to go back to those behaviors again. And so it's a very, very optimistic kind of thing there. And you're only looking at 3 to 5% that are going to be what you label your high risk offenders that you really have to worry about this continuing. But kids respond so well to it. But you're right, it is a family. It needs to be treated within the family, not just individually. Certainly those are the first steps, and those interventions need to be done. But a good thing to do is to bring those siblings together if that's something the survivor wants. To be a part of some of those sessions. And like I said, it's all, I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. It's all driven by the survivor and what is it that they want. But it certainly needs to be addressed, within the family because of what's happened.
Now, do you find, for the success rate, is there a certain age range that you catch it by in order for this to happen?
Yeah. So the research says really prior to 18. But what we do see as far as the frequency and when this stuff happens the most is 12 to 14. And so the earlier you catch it, obviously prevention's number one, but if you can't, in that 12 to 14 age range, and then a lot of these cases really plateau around 14. You're more concerned about higher risk. If you've got a 17-year-old sexually abusing a 5-year-old, that's a different level. I think we all can kind of see that, but 12 to 14 is really where we see a lot of it taking place. Okay.
And do you see, the abuser, in my opinion, something would have had to have happened to them in order for them to start acting out. Kids don't just typically start sexually abusing other kids just for the heck of it. Right. Either they've seen something, they've been exposed to something, or they've had something happen to them. Is that your expertise as well?
Yeah. There's a lot of that goes on. And the thought used to be is, well, the only way these kids would sexually abuse is they've received their own sexual abuse. And there certainly is a measure of that. But you hit on a really good point. Things that they see, pornography, can have a big play on this. Other risk factors are, and you talked about this in your example. You did a great job of that. Child maltreatment, abuse, neglect, seeing domestic violence. Kids, what you look at too with sibling sexual abuse is the power dynamic. So is one child receiving a ton of power? We call it a parentified child, where they're like a little adult, kind of reigning over their younger siblings. You can see other kinds of problematic behaviors in general. That they could be a risk factor for that. So there's a lot of other risk factors, but particularly with the rise of more and more violent kinds of pornography, the easy access that the kids have, the lack of supervision. I was reading a study where the average teenager or adolescent has three and a half devices, phones, tablets, those kinds of things, electronic devices. So those aren't being supervised typically. Because they're looking at porn on their phones, and those can play a role into it. One of many factors.
Okay. Now you got me wanting to go check out my kids' phones. No, no, I know better. But oh my gosh, I had a question and then I just totally lost it. So do we see this more prevalent with like males being the abuser, or is it half and half, male to female, or, what are some of those stats look like?
Yeah. So the research shakes out to about 92, 93% are males. Okay. And so they're typically abusing younger sisters. There's also about, according to one study, 25% of cases that they examined were male on male. So that's obviously a big portion too. But what we're seeing is the numbers are actually much higher for sisters that are abusing younger siblings. They aren't reported that way. So, right now in the literature, it's about 7%. It's actually much, much higher than that. We don't have a good basis to go off of though, but
yeah.
Discussions I have with people in different articles in the literature talk about that. That's actually much higher, but that they're not, making it through the system. Like
I think in just about any type of sexual assault scenario, the numbers are higher than what we know, because there's just so many people who don't report, especially the males, because it's masculine.
That's a great point. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you touched a little bit in the beginning, and that's where I wanted to go was, how do we know what the difference is between curiosity and exploration and then abuse? Where's that line?
Yeah. One of the big ways to determine is motivation. So what's the motivation? Is it sexual gratification? Is it curiosity? Well, if it's curiosity, typically they're going to be, really close in age. It's going to happen once or twice, but we know this, it's healthy, playing doctor, it's natural for siblings to want to explore,
I'll show you mine if you show me yours.
Exactly. So all that is normal and healthy. Well, it's not so normal with certain ages. It's not normal for a 12-year-old to do that with a 6-year-old. Mm-hmm. Now, certainly sibling sexual abuse, occurs no matter what the age is. But those are some things that we can look at. Does it keep returning to sexual activity? Because it should only happen once or twice when you're talking about curiosity. And then, what's the motivation behind it? Are we seeing, secrecy? Is there fear? Is there shame involved? Pressure, we call it things like grooming, threats, all those kinds of things. And we really look at what's the power differential? That's a huge role in sibling sexual abuse. And, it's things like manipulation, coercion, force, those kinds of things accompany it too.
Right. What do we do? As parents, let's say, you suspect that something is happening with one of your kids. Maybe you suspect that it's one of the other siblings, but you have nothing to really base your guesses, your gut instincts on. So your concerns, that's what I was trying to go for. So what do we do? Because as a mom myself, I don't know that I would want to come right out and say, hey, is somebody hurting you? And then it not be true. But then on the other hand, I don't want to not come out and say, is somebody hurting you? And have it be, it happening and I ignore it. So.
Yeah, there's obviously different approaches. And I tell people it's based on your children but follow your gut. I think is number one. But two, establishing the kind of relationship where your kids can come to you no matter what. And I would just ask those questions. If you're seeing a lot of these signs, and obviously there's lots of cases that the signs don't necessarily present, particularly with younger children yet, but you pay attention to the signs, that really center around changes in behavior. Susie's just acting different, or she's having crying spells, or she's really social, but she's isolating all the time. Or, when Johnny comes in the room, she wants to leave, or she's turning white, or, whatever the case is, those changes in behavior, and just let them talk. And they're so masked by fear, because the sibling that's committing sexual harm, is telling them all kinds of stuff. And so we find younger siblings that are often as interested in keeping the abuse a secret as the one who's doing the offending on it. So
Sure.
it's just trying to let them talk and don't be afraid to ask the questions.
Yeah. Yeah, because the abusers are going to use a lot of the same terminology that other outside abusers would use. Don't tell mom and dad, or I'm going to hurt you, or you're going to get in trouble. They're going to think you liked it, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So they're going to say a lot of those same type of terminology in order to get them to stay quiet. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, this is such an intense, deep subject. And I know, definitely, I know, like you said before, they need to get help. They need to get therapy. But is there some other stuff that they can do, that parents can do? Obviously, education, start talking about bodies, my body, my choice as early as possible. That kind of thing. I know I did with mine. I have all girls, so, I kind of lucked out on that area, but, we still talked about the difference between boys and girls and, my body, my choice. Nobody should be touching you in any areas that you don't want them to, all of that.
Right.
So prevention, absolutely. Yeah. But, what are some other steps that we can take to either prevent it, or if it does happen, to stop it?
Yeah, I think, the biggest thing, kind of like what I talked about earlier, is just that relationship with your kids. Yeah, you bring up a good point, like what you did with your girls, is it isn't a one-time discussion. A lot of times parents are like, well, we're going to talk about sex when you're 14 and we're going to do it once and I'm going to be really uncomfortable. And that's way too late. You need to start young, 2 or 3. These are the body parts. We don't let people touch you there. You tell me, all those things you were talking about. And then just having that ongoing discussion. And then how are we reacting to things that our kids tell us that we may not like, or, we may find disturbing? So those can be barometers that they look at. So, for example, my kid thinks, hey, I freak out if, I talk about, hey, I saw some porn. It's like we need to be able to talk about to kids in ways without becoming overly judgmental, overly emotional, and be that kind of safe space that they're confident in coming to us to talk to us about anything. And particularly, questions about sex or sexuality, because those are all, like what we talked about, very normal and natural things to do. So are they going to come to us? Are they going to go to their friends? Or are they going to go to porn? And that's usually what they find out. And we just need to be talking to kids much more frequently in an ongoing conversation, much earlier than any previous generation.
Absolutely. It wasn't talked about when I was growing up, that's for sure. When it was time for the talk, my mom gave me a book and said, here you go, have at it. Thanks, Mom. And instead of prevention, my dad, when I was like, I think 16, I was talking about one of the pregnant girls at school one day, and he was like, well, do you think you need birth control? And I'm like, no, but didn't tell him. I was already took care of that, Dad, Yeah. But when it came to my kids, it was, look, if you think you're going to start having sex, you need to come to me. Let's make sure you're protected. Let's make sure you're covered. We'll talk about it. Doesn't mean I'm condoning it by any stretch of the imagination, but I know teenagers and I know they're going to do it no matter what, so exactly having that open communication and not freaking out. You can freak out later when they're not around,
right?
But don't freak out in front of them. It's very hard to do when, you're talking about your babies being adults. It's very hard, but if you create that safe space for them early on, absolutely. What about if there's an outside family member who sees something and they're not sure, maybe it was just a one-time motion that they saw, or a reaction, or something like that? Do they speak up and say something to the parents, or do they just maybe it was nothing? Speak.
How many, we see all kinds of situations where uncomfortable, didn't want to address it. I mean, my experience from talking to lots and lots of people and their experiences is follow your gut. If you think something's wrong, it probably is. And it's always better to address it than to come back later and be like, man, I missed it. And I mean, sibling sexual abuse goes on, longer than really any other kind. And you're talking years. Some cases, it could be hundreds of times of abuse. So we've got to root it out. So yeah, teachers may see something. You have other relatives, so they can see things. So don't be afraid, to kind of pull them aside, and you're expressing concern. Hey, I care about you, and this is what I'm saying. Is everything okay?
Yeah.
And ask.
Should they go to the child or should they go to the parents?
Well, I'd start. Well, it depends where you're at. So certainly I would go to parents too, but not to be afraid. If it's a teacher or somebody, to do both.
Yeah.
To do both. But yeah, I mean, certainly let those parents know, without question.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh gosh. Well, Brad, thank you so much. This is it's a difficult topic to talk about because nobody wants to think about their babies hurting each other like that, Right. So I appreciate you coming on and talking with us today. And hopefully somebody's out there listening that this is going to help.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tracy. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Listeners, I will have all of Brad's information in the show notes as always. Just go to releasingtraumapodcast.com and pull up his episode, and all his contact information will be there. If you are in this situation or you think you're in this situation or, whatever, I would definitely grab a copy of his book and, read his book and, reach out if you need to. Ask him questions. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to point you in the right direction.
Absolutely.
And, hey, listeners, if you're listening on one of the platforms like Apple Podcasts, iHeart, whatever, do me a favor and hit that like button so that I can start getting some likes on those. I never asked for that. And so I kind of need to. So yeah, just do me a favor, hit that like button. But thank you as always for listening. We will talk to you in the next show. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure you hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss a show. Be sure to check us out on our new socials on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.